All right. Hey, good afternoon. Or is it evening?
Yeah.
No,
It's
afternoon.
afternoon now.
Afternoon.
Technically.
Hey, so we're gonna do some introductions. I'm gonna ask their names and before we get started. So just at the forefront, my name is Efrain Perdomo. I know Damien and Brittany, but I don't think I know the rest of you necessarily. I'm a local pastor at Salem Alliance Church, and also student development director is kind of my official title for ministry training school that we have for our CMA denomination. That's kind of a part of our church at Salem Alliance Church. So that's currently what I'm doing now. I actually attended the school, I graduated in 2017, so it's from 2012 to 2017. So kind of a longer years here, but then went to Dallas Theological Seminary to work on my master's, so I got a THM over there. So yeah, that's me. And
Yes, my name is Lisa Rusi, and since 2020, I've been at Northwest University up in Kirkland as an intercultural studies professor. And before that, I was a missionary both in Bangladesh and in France, working most specifically with women in prostitution, or the Daughters of Women in Prostitution, and anti-trafficking work with the Assemblies of God World Mission. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah. Kind of the way I wanted to start us out is just kind of introductions, who you are, where are you serving, kind of what ministries are you involved with, and then why this class, why join this class, what's kind of what you want to get out of it as it pertains to you. So we'll start with you.
All right. My name is Mike West. I just recently transitioned to lead pastor in Wilmington, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
9 years former in Murray Point. So the reason why I wanted this class is because I went from a non-diversified area to a very diversified area.
Oh.
And so just being able to have a better understanding of that.
You said Willamina?
Mm-hmm.
Where is that?
Willamina is actually, it's 30 miles west of here, so it's in between here and Lincoln City on Highway 22.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Damien, I'm a Youth Alive missionary. I serve with Tom Bachman and oversee the Oregon Youth Alive Ministry Academy. I'm most interested in this because, I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts and questions, and I feel like I don't have a lot of people to ask. There's so few minorities in any of the churches that I visit and see, and even me personally, I only have a handful of minority friends, and most of them, when I ask, they're usually say, oh, I don't know, or you know, I mean, I want to know more.
Yeah.
I want to know how we could be the Big C church.
Yeah, totally. Good.
I'm Adam Schweitz. I'm one of the leaders, I don't know what I am right now, at Sherwood New Life. I've been predominantly youth ministry for years, but we're doing things different coming up, and not sure what all that looks like. But yeah, it's kind of been the same thing, a lot of questions, and I serve with Terry, she's our lead pastor, and so it's been kind of God moving us in a direction as a suburb of Portland, and what does that look like within the realms of diversity in Portland, you know, what that entails.
Yeah, that's good.
And I'm Terry Purcell, and I am the lead pastor at Adams Church, Sherwood New Life, Assembly of God.
Okay.
And we are just outside of Portland, and so we have a lot of all of the topics, you know, being covered, and have really felt the Lord lead us in, you know, to learn and to be able to equip our people to love people that don't have the same opinions, the same look, the same background, everything that they do. And yeah.
That's good. Thanks for sharing. Well, one of the things we wanted to do, I think, is share a little bit of our story. One of the things that often can happen in discussions like this is focusing too much on the technical aspects of this and not kind of understanding the relational component of it. And I think our I wouldn't even call it expertise, I don't know what you'd call it. Our knowledge in this subject really comes not only in what we studied, but also in our experience of life. So in particular to myself, both of my parents are immigrants. My dad is from Honduras, San Pedro, Honduras, and my mom is from Oaxaca, Mexico. And actually my mom is the one who converted my dad while they moved in, when they met in East Los Angeles. And so they, obviously, I grew up in a Christian home, and they obviously made their way over to Oregon. But one of the common experiences that I grew up, which might be different than many of you here, I'm not sure, but is just kind of living two worlds simultaneously, and also trying to discover my own world at that same time. One being deeply rooted in Hispanic root and just the way things are done in other countries. Not only that, you got two countries working with each other in my mom and dad, but also assimilating to some extent to the American culture. And that not only lived out in the school life, my social life, but also in the church itself. And so growing up, obviously as a teenager, having English being kind of the more lingua franca for me at the time, slowly started to being pulled more into the American culture, but still trying to hold on to what is my parents' culture as well. And how that looks like in the church is just a very unique dynamic. So I just want to share one quick story about kind of what led me on this path. When I was little, I got sick. We used to live in Merrill. I don't know if you guys know where Merrill is at, in kind of outside Klamath Falls. I got really sick, and I remember kind of growing up there. Our family started attending a church there. It was really small, about like 30 people. No one was Hispanic except us. It was a demographic, a little bit older generation, probably more in the 60s and 70s. And we were a young family, or my mom and dad were a young family. And just the dynamics were weird for me. One, don't look like us. Another, they don't speak Spanish, we don't speak English, so why go there? It's not like my parents were getting anything out of the messages necessarily. And we spent like at least 5 years there, which I just always stuck with me. And as I grew older, I asked my dad, why did we do that? What was the spirit behind us being a part of a church where we understood nothing? And really, he told me that when I was sick, I went to the hospital, had pneumonia as a infant child, and this church somehow figured out about our family's need and the huge medical bill that we racked up, in this small group of congregants who looked nothing like us, didn't know us really well, just came around and provided and helped us out with our medical bills. And so my dad, out of honor, thought it would be appropriate for us to spend a couple of years there for these people. And obviously relationships grew and connections were drawn, even amidst the really the differences. And for me, I feel like that's a catalyst for not only my work as a pastor, but also in this particular subject area. So
for me, I am technically third generation, so my grandparents on both sides came. One from my mom's side of the family is from Mexico, and my dad's side of the family is from Puerto Rico, which is why some Puerto Ricans can be pretty light-skinned. So I have this. I feel like I have an ambiguous ethnicity. Nobody really knows where I'm from. But I grew up, first 9 years of my life was in Spanish-English bilingual church. So everything was the pastor spoke in Spanish and translated himself into English. Worship was predominantly in Spanish, and then kids' church and all of that was bilingual. Which I always would joke. I mean, it definitely helped me with my Spanish. My grandmother also lived next door to us, and all of my mom was one of 11 children, and they all lived within 5 minutes of each other. So we were definitely like the typical close-knit family, parent, everyone coming in. But so the bilingual church, was my first experience, and so being pretty much all Hispanic, and then moved when we were about 9 years old, because we would drive 45 minutes to go to that church to East Chicago, because I'm from the Chicago area, and we decided to go to a church nearby. Even though our community was about 60% Hispanic, the Assemblies of God church that we went to, which was 5 minutes from my house, was 100% white, and so we were the only Hispanic family for a long time until a Puerto Rican family came in. And then we were the only two families. And so that was an interesting perspective. As a missionary, I will say this is it's something to think about, but God called me to be into missions at kids camp. I was 9 years old. I had just started going to that church. And I questioned whether or not I could actually be a missionary, because every missionary I'd ever seen was a white man. And so and the pictures of the people who are supposed to receive mission looked more like me, or looked more like the people from my family than the actual people who are missionaries. And so just even some of the symbols and the things that we said and presented in front of people kind of communicated something to me. So it's personal to both of us, and so we want to talk about it a little bit more. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's really helpful for us as we kind of interact with you along. So we hope that you can ask questions and maybe insert some things that you're thinking as we go along. I'll maybe ask you a question as we go along. But the way we frame this topic is sort of my half, which I'll kind of go over, is a little bit more of what is the biblical theology behind what we're saying. As believers of faith, we're always grounded in Scripture and its authority. So we want to know. Obviously, there's details and gaps that may be with that. Obviously, the Scripture doesn't tell us about everything we need to know about race and ethnicity and how you are supposed to conduct yourself in a church in relation to that in your context. But it does give us an ideal of what is the church supposed to look like and why. So I'll do a little bit of biblical exploration of just what are some of those passages, texts that give us insight into how to understand this topic a little bit better. And then Lisa will kind of talk more in relation to the practicality of it all. Like what are some things we can do? What are some things we need to consider when we're wanting to approach this subject, especially in our local church? And then we'll have some questions afterwards for you guys to wrestle with. But like I said, I'm starting with, just let's think of a biblical worldview. And the way I wanted to start out is just knowing that the book of the Bible is not isolated or distant from other cultures and other ethnicities, other people groups. The Bible and the stories that we hear, the narrations of Israel's story and also God's story is in the context of other people groups and its interactions with it all. Obviously, the Israelite nation is a big emphasis in how it interacts with other cultures in the Old Testament. And obviously, Jesus is in a context in the first century where we see these different cultures. And some of those that we want to highlight, the Asiatics, Israel and Semitic cousins, the Cushites, the Egyptians, the Indo-Europeans, Philistines, and Hittites. That's largely the demographic and group that you'll see in the Old Testament. New Testament, we have the Greco-Roman world, Greeks, barbarians, the Jewish diaspora. So when we think of the New Testament, often we think in these simpler terms of Gentile, Jew. Obviously, there's way more at play, more dynamics, and specifically even with the Jewish community, we have Jews who have been displaced and for long periods of time in communities, much like an immigrant who maybe moved to a different location and now has sort of toiling with what is the Hebrew culture and its root, but also modifying and adapting it in order to, I wouldn't say assimilate, but integrate into what is now the reality, right? So a good example of that for the Jewish diaspora is, are you guys familiar with the Septuagint, by any chance? So this is, for those who don't know, the Greek Septuagint is the Old Testament translated into Greek, largely because of this reality. Hebrew was sort of a language that was harder to retain among these people who were displaced. And so the solution to that was to translate it. And there's obviously a lot to that. Obviously, we also have Black African, Kush, Monroe, Ethiopia, North Africa, Berbers and Phoenicians, Greeks and Romans, and Antalya, Celts, and others. So yeah, just a good framework. And I would say too, as a pastor, and maybe for those of you who preach and those of you who think about, it's important to highlight these cultures and things in the background of the text, so that your people don't just assume there's just one culture or one emphasize. I think it's important for us to, as we're preaching, and obviously you can only do so much in that, but to emphasize what is the background that is going on. Okay, I'm going to ask you every time we kind of focus on one text, I want to ask you, what do you think this is telling us about race or ethnicities or diversity? So one, I titled this Foundations, Imago Dei. I'll read it out loud, and then hopefully if you guys have any suggestions. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creepy thing that creeps on the earth. That is my favorite verse. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. What is that telling us about race, ethnicity, even if it's more implicit rather than explicit?
The first thing that comes to mind to me, and again, not getting into a Trinity theology here, but God in three persons creates man in his image, and if his image is expressed, however you want to define that, in three different ways, then God himself can make man in multiple ways.
Yeah, good. Anything else? It doesn't say, let us make the Hebrew or the Jewish people in our image. It says, let us make man in our image. Humankind, the Hebrew word Adam, it's not a focal point, which, take this into account. This would have been very beneficial for a sacred text to say that for a people group, right? To say that the Israelites are the beginning origins of society, or the beginning origins of the people group. So to say that every man is created in his image is quite a provocative statement. Another reason for that, also to be provocative, is the image of God, Imago Dei, is actually not a unique term to this literature. If you look at ancient Near Eastern literature, which is kind of the type of literature that's around this time and also in the same similar location, this idea of the image of God was pretty prominent, but only referred to kings. So our scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, they're kind of, what they're saying is that not only kings, but we all are made in the image of God. And obviously this gets played a little bit more too when we talk about Jesus being the ultimate fulfillment of that, right? Precedent, biblical theology through the Old Testament. Let me just ask, any of those, let's think of those stories. We have the Abrahamic covenant, the sojourner and foreigners, Moses and intermarriage, the monarchy. You have the Cushite soldiers from A&E literature, ancient Near Eastern literature, that's what it stands for. We have the book of Ruth, the imprecatory Psalms, prophets, emphasizing on justice. So think of maybe any of those aspects that relate to the Old Testament. Why do you think I would list them as a theology that helps us understand diversity, ethnicity, race?
Ask the question again.
Yeah, why would I write these stories? So these are particular stories in the Pentateuch. These kind of this demographic is in a lot of the monarchy literature, Second and First Samuel, or First and Second Samuel, Judges, the Book of Ruth, prophets, there's the imprecatory psalms, prophets, emphasis on justice. Why do you think I believe that these subjects in the Old Testament relate to race and ethnicity and diversity? I could give you one, sojourners and foreigners. So this idea of a foreigner, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, there's actually a law that talks about our interactions with sojourners and foreigners and how we are to be hospitable to them. And actually in the excess of blessing that God gives us, we are to give that to the foreigner and sojourner. Another one is the book of Ruth, which we'll actually talk a little bit later, but we think about the prophets and their emphasis on justice. Justice being not only for Israel itself, but also for the marginalized people and for those that are oppressed. We see that in the imprecatory Psalms as well, where there's this kind of, this is the literature where you hear a lot of angry, violent language, and we almost want to skip through it because it seems very uncomfortable to us the way they talk. Important thing to know in the background of that this is written by an oppressed people group. So it sort of shows the language of what does God want to include in the theology of people who are oppressed, and what God himself being the savior and the ultimate form of justice for these people groups. And then lastly, if you guys know the Abrahamic covenant, what is that in particular? Does anyone know? It's kind of a blessing of land, descendants, and then I can't remember.
Blessing to all nations.
To all nations. There's already this mandate of blessing the other nations and other people groups.
I was going to say, it's interesting when you first asked the question, my brain just initially went, well, yeah, there's a lot of foreigners, in all of those stories, and obviously they drive the narrative, or drive some of the narratives in those, but then as you're talking about it, it's like, but also in each of those stories there's instruction of how to relate with and treat other people.
Totally.
I hadn't thought of that.
That kind of mirrors Paul's writing at the beginning of Romans. Where he's telling that basically the story of God introducing himself to a specific group of people, but in order to fulfill the purpose of reaching everybody else, and Romans 2 leading it off with how the Israelites were failing at doing that.
You can almost say Paul is taking the Abrahamic covenant pretty seriously, right? Blessing to all nations. Okay, these are the ones I wanted to focus on. I wanted to open up, wanted to open up Exodus actually. I have Leviticus on there, but I'll explain that in a little bit. Open up Exodus. Actually, does anyone have their Bible? No. Just your phone. Let me read it really quick. I'll actually start at verse 33. So this is context. Egypt is tired of the Israelites and has been going through what has been a difficult time for the Pharaoh and wants to officially let them go. And he says the Egyptians were urgent with, and this is kind of during the Passover narrative as well. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they asked for the Egyptians for silver and gold, jewelry, for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sights of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. This is the key verse, verse 38. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. So there's this actually like this narrative speaking to Israel has just been in has been in slavery and in bondage for this massive amounts of time, and we get that subtle note that I don't think often we know or highlight, is that not only when they were released as the people of God, some other people went with them. So there's this idea of, we're sort of getting the hints of like, Israel is the chosen nation to be priesthood to all the nations, but even the acceptance is already happening as the narrative kind of goes, and we'll get more and more hints of that. And the reason I put Leviticus on there is because Damien, you mentioned the instruction behind it. Now it becomes a command, a part of the law. So not only are we accepting of the stranger, but also it says, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Another book I wanted to highlight is the book of Ruth, about a Moabite widow who interactions with Naomi. Naomi's wanting to go back to the land, and Ruth says this: do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. So Ruth being a Moabite, we're getting these hints, and what's interesting about Ruth is this is a whole book dedicated to this story. The kinsman redeemer and the aspects that come, and Ruth actually becomes a part of the lineage of the Messiah and the Jesse's lineage. So we're getting hints of it, obviously, and as we're exploring along. Well, let's go to the New Testament really quick. Restoration, biblical theology in the New Testament, in the Gospels. Just to highlight some of these. The incarnation, Jesus' incarnation is sort of plays into this idea, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly. We get Jesus actually has to go to Egypt to be, or his parents have to go to Egypt because of the slaughtering that's happening, sort of reimagining Israel's story, right? Israel having to go to Egypt as well. And then there's that famous Hosea text, out of Egypt I called my son. But there's this aspect of Jesus being a displaced person. And that's why he really emphasizes that during his ministry, and actually uses his story in relation to that. The Great Commission, obviously we know that the Great Commission is pretty direct for us Christians in the early church. Go out to all the nations, making disciples. And for us to scatter among the nations, it's a big call for us. So it's not, hey, let's talk about the gospel, let's make disciples amongst our people group and let's stay, but let's actually be in movement, and actually that being one of the imperatives of discipleship. You are not being a disciple if you are not sending and going. The Good Samaritan, we know that story, Jesus using a hated group, a depressed group by the Jewish community in order to highlight who is actually a demonstration and who actually exemplifies faith is a Samaritan. If you know the story about the Samaritans, many of the Jews would actually go to different routes, take longer routes to avoid Samaria. The day of Pentecost, I'll mention that in a little bit, the Council of Jerusalem, Paul's letters. What was your name again? Adam, you highlighted this a little bit. Paul he's eager to get this message as well. I will be, what does he say? I will be, be all peoples to all peoples kind of thing. So neither Jew nor Greek is a big emphasis in the letter of Galatians, and the unity of the church in Ephesians. So we'll focus on the unity of the church. This is Ephesians 4:3-6. Eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, and Father of all, who is all, over all, and through all, and in all. So the gospel message, Jesus dying in our place, giving us new life, a new community, reimagining that new community. And not only are we reconciled horizontally with God himself, but actually with each other. And that is highlighted, not only reconciliation among the people you're surrounded by, but other people groups. And then we get that demonstrated really well in the book of Acts, in Acts 2, 5 through 6. It says, "Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven, and at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language." You guys love that text here at the Assemblies of God. This is kind of your staple, if you will. I love to emphasize tongues, but what's really beautiful about this picture is the nations coming together. The nations coming together, and actually that being an echo and a reflection of what happened in Babel. In Babel, the people scattered. Here, in the book of Acts, people actually now come together, and there's a list of people groups that are listed in this book, and then the apostleship and sending of the disciples to minister to the nations. And lastly, this is where I want to end us. Obviously, we're kind of getting this more fuller picture of what is kind of the ideal for Jesus' kingdom, God's reign, and this is sort of a hint of where we're going, destiny. And it says, Revelation 5, 9 through 10, "And they sang a new song, saying, 'Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe, language, people, and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and a priest to our God, and they shall reign on the earth.'" Beautiful picture. These are very important words, every tribe, language, people, and nation. It could have said singular Israelites, the Jewish community. It could have said that, but the demonstration of the people of God is the mix, not conformity, but the diversity and unity together. So obviously that doesn't tell you how you should act or what you should do, but it allows you to have the theological ideal and also the imperative to be moved and to think creatively about this subject. Last thing I would say is two other things, which the question now bears is, what do we do in the intermediary time? The time when heaven is still not here, Jesus is not returned, but we're still asked to bear the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And as Brian Lourdes says, we want our sanctuary to look like our mission field. So that's me.
All right, thank you so much. So thank you for just kind of walking us through that. And I'm sure that I think what we found is that you're here probably because you believe in that, but it's just good to have that articulation because not everyone recognizes what God is asking of us in the biblical theology of the nations, and understanding what God is doing in the nations and how from the very beginning God was thinking about the nations, which I just love. As a missiologist, of course, I really love it. But so today I'm going to talk to you about practical advice, and we're going to talk a little bit about culture, a little bit about, not a lot about contextualization, but I wish I could talk to you. I wish we could just talk for a really long time. So what we do right now in education and theological education is like, we say, you want to be a pastor, come to all these pastoral classes, and then we say, do you want to be a missionary? Go to some take the theology classes, but also take all these culture classes. And today I think we probably need to adjust that a bit, and I just always try to convince the ministry students that aren't in missions to come take some cultural classes, because the truth is we need to think about culture when we're thinking about diversity. Because if we're open to having a diverse church, that means we have to be open to allowing, to letting go some of our own cultural norms and our own cultural comfort. And so one thing that we're going to talk about a couple tensions. And I'm getting most of this from Lingenfelter's book, Ministering Cross-Culturally. So if you want to grab that, that's a great book if you want culture diversity or you already have culture diversity in your church. But also, if you're going to do short-term mission trips, it's also got some good insight into that. But as we start, we have to know what our culture is. And if you sit down and you go, I don't have culture, that means you're a part of the dominant culture. right? If you don't feel like you have culture, it's because you see your culture everywhere and you've never had to think about it. I teach culture anthropology at Northwest University, and about half my students just hate it. They just hate the class. And I was like getting down on myself. Now this is like a bunch of people have to take it, and some of them they have to take it. Anyway, and like nursing majors and stuff like that. And so, but I was talking to a friend of mine, and she's like, when I took culture anthropology in college, I hated it too because we just never thought about culture. Because she comes from the predominant white culture. But when you're, as me, like at 17 years old, having to go to doctor's appointments with my grandmother because she only spoke Spanish, you think about culture all the time. And so it's like all the students of color love it because it's like we are constantly thinking about it. But we have to think about what is our culture and how much of like we do church is just totally in our culture. Like, so we've been enculturated from day one. So why don't we pick our nose? Because when we were a kid, our parents told us over and over again not to pick our nose. But in Bangladesh, it's totally fine to pick your nose in public. Because it's what our culture says is bad manners. Why wouldn't we eat with our elbows on the table? Why do we put our, everything, why do we use a fork and knife instead of using our hands? So culture is a part of us, but it's not necessarily tied to biblical truth. And so we have to think about that. And I'm going to talk just a tiny bit at the very end about contextualization. But the truth is that actually, before we even think about, when we say contextualization, previously we used to think, okay, I'm going to take this gospel message and I'm going to think about who I'm talking to, and I'm going to help contextualize it. And like a simple way to think of it is if you said, we talked about the Trinity and you were talking to a professor of philosophy, you would not speak the same way as you were talking to a 5-year-old. You contextualize the message. But the truth is that you first, when we think of other cultures in our communities, we have to decontextualize from where we are to, because we've already contextualized the culture. We already read the Bible with Western eyes. That's another one of the misreading scripture with Western eyes is another great book that's up there. So these are a few things that we have to think about and tensions that we need to consider when we're talking about cultural contextualization. So one of them is time orientation. So question for you. You have a one-on-one meeting with somebody, either that's a leader or maybe on staff with you, and you're supposed to meet at 12 o'clock. So this is someone that you technically have a little bit of authority over, like, okay? They're either a leader or they're staff. So meeting's at 12 o'clock. At what point, when they're late, do you start to feel tension? Not necessarily anger, but tension. How many minutes late would they need to be before you start to feel tension? 5 minutes. Anybody else?
15.
15? 1 minute.
Bro, get
Dude,
some
I'm a
patience.
Tom.
Yeah.
He was like 10 minutes early every
I think you should have
time.
been in the anxiety class.
So no, and then, like I just want you to know that there's no wrong answer. This is just the cultural answer, right? So 5 minutes, between 5 and 15 minutes. What about you start to feel angry? Like I am now starting to feel like maybe not. I might still not tell them off, but I'm about to leave. Like, and I'm kind of frustrated. How many minutes? 10. 30.
Gosh, you're so nice. 5 maybe.
5 maybe. Okay.
Depends on if they communicate, right? Are they gonna text me?
So the normal American time is 5 minutes for tension, 15 minutes like anger, frustration. I'm leaving, or I'm gonna text them and say, hey, I haven't heard from you, and I'm gonna move on with my day. French, would work well in France. 15 minutes, you start to feel tension. 30 minutes, you're like, okay, I'm done. We're waiting. Bangladesh is about an hour. You start to feel tension. An hour and a half to 2 hours late, and you're kind of done with it, right? Latin America, somewhere in between those spaces. So we're talking about we want to have a culturally diverse group, and maybe one of our strategies is to actually have leaders or even a pastor that's from a different culture. And so this is going to be great. And now that pastor is an hour late to your team meeting. And what do you think? What do you do? What does God say about this? But let me just give you some reasons for this. So time orientation. We have a concern for punctuality and amount of time expended. I don't waste my time. Time can be wasted. It's something that can be quantified. Careful allocation of time to achieve the maximum within set limits. tightly scheduled, goal-oriented activities, reward offered as incentives for effective use of time, emphasis on dates and history. Okay, so that's us, that's the Western American space. Event orientation, concern for details of the event regardless of the time required, exhaustive consideration of a problem until resolved. It let what come what may. So if this was a conference in an event-oriented space, we would say there's a breakout session. When you're done, just make your way to the next thing. But if we got a really good conversation going, we could spend the whole afternoon just in this breakout session because we said, we like this, we're doing well. Same thing with one-on-ones. I have a one-on-one with Rosa, and we are gonna talk until we're done talking.
Yes.
And if my next one-on-one is with Efrain, he's gonna have to wait, and he's gonna understand that I was in an important conversation. I can come to him, I'm an hour late, and I can say, you know what, my last appointment, the Holy Spirit was just moving, and we were just getting stuff done. And here's the thing that's kind of interesting about that old school Pentecostalism. How many of you heard the word tarry? Mm-hmm. They used to tarry at the altar. Yeah. That was event, or the reason why we don't tarry anymore.
My name is Terry, so I remember that very well.
The reason why we don't tarry anymore is because we are time oriented.
Yeah.
But what do we do if half of our congregation is coming from event orientation and they're ready to tarry at the altar? Yeah. Or they're like, worship is going, let's keep going. Are we ready? Do we want a diverse church? Are we ready for different cultures? Are we okay with allowing some of our own cultural space? So which one do you think between these two, the time orientation versus the event orientation, I'm just looking at my time now, between these two, which one do you think is biblical? And just if you can think of an example of one of them, maybe. Yeah.
I'd say it's probably the event orientation, because you think of the idea of the dinner table, and especially in a lot of other cultures other than America, you have that idea of we eat, but the meal isn't just the food part of it, it's the rest of the interaction at that table, welcoming people to have conversation, relationship over the meal table, and the food's just a small piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. It makes me think of being in France, and it was like, the other thing is, by the way, in France we planted a bilingual church, so we had 25% American, 25% French, and then 50% other, like a lot from the African countries and South American countries. That was our church. Anyway, so but in France, this is just French, which is technically Western, but meals are 5 hours. You have someone over for lunch, they come over at noon, they leave at 5 o'clock. You have someone over for dinner, you start at 7, they'll leave at midnight. And there's no way getting around. You cannot even nudge them out. They will leave exactly 5 hours later. So there's this idea of time. So we see some biblical examples of the John the Baptist sends his disciples of Jesus. Because another part of this is you don't have to schedule time together. So you're the pastor or you're a deacon or whatever. Someone is allowed to come over your house without telling you they're coming over. And just be like, hey, let's have a chat. Like I told you about my own family, my aunts and uncles would come over all the time. And if it was dinner time, they're like, oh, it's dinner, come on in. Mm-hmm. We'll make you some more, we'll make you a plate, right? And so this is event oriented too. Yeah. And so you have John the Baptist, you have Nicodemus who comes to Jesus at night. He doesn't schedule an appointment. He comes at a kind of an inconvenient time just to talk to him. Jesus sits and talks to the Samaritan woman. And then they stay there longer. And obviously Jesus is moving around oftentimes by time. But then we also see him talking about things like, he talks about how the perfect time has come for Jesus to preach. Or sometimes he says in Matthew 16:12, the time has come for Jesus to explain his suffering, death, and resurrection. And so sometimes there are some scheduled moments in Jesus' space, but for the most part, he is much more event-based. Another one, and again, I'm not going to get to go through all these really well, but we'll try to talk through some of them. So judgment, how do we make judgments? Dichotomous thinking versus black and white thinking. So do you judge someone on specific behavior or the whole of their character? What do you think?
I think the whole of their character.
Whole of their character?
You can't really get the whole puzzle by one action or one sentence or one phrase. Or I can't call someone tardy or someone that's not punctual because they didn't show up to their meeting within a 15 to 30 minute time frame.
Here's another way to say it. What about Ravi Zacharias? So we still use his material even though he was sexually abusive to a lot of women. Is he completely gone, or do we say some things are still redeemable? Still redeemable?
You know, that's a hard one, because I would like to say that I'm not going to judge somebody for being 15 minutes late, but in reality, I just might. But then when it comes to Ravi Zacharias, I like his written material, didn't like what he did, but then I can justify doing the opposite of what I've done in a different situation.
I was gonna echo that. I was gonna say for Ravi Zacharias, I'm like, well, yeah, he wrote some really great things, even though he was making horrible choices. But then I think about my own life and the way that I treat the people close to me, and I do. If someone is 15 minutes late, I put that back in the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, in the memory bank. Not saying like, oh, they're a terrible person, but I go, okay, this is someone I can't trust to be on time. Which,
Yeah.
again, the key there being, this is someone I can't trust.
Yeah.
And
Well-
it's time management versus some really serious
Yeah.
issues.
That's true.
Well, yeah, and the thing, I'll just go back to the time thing really fast. Okay, like imagine that you say we have a high Hispanic population, so we're going to hire, our youth pastor's going to be Hispanic, and they're late all the time. I just want you to think about the fact that they probably are the most relational person, and they're probably doing the right work for that population. So like, even though for us, like we're like, oh, they're late, they might be doing exactly what they need to be doing for the population that they're in, because they need to be relational. They need to sit and talk with a parent for 30 more minutes and be late to your meeting. And so that's an interesting, this is the point of talking through this stuff.
Well, I
Yeah.
was going to shine a little bit more light on that too. Like, you never know what's going on in their previous engagement.
Yeah.
You know, even if they weren't in a special meeting with someone, you know, maybe they were dealing with a catastrophe at home. You know, one could say, well, you shouldn't bring that into the church. There's no other church there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, are we really going to be so callous to say that we're so business focused and go that route versus why we're here as a church in general? So that's why me in general, yeah, I value people's time. I think that's one of the most expensive thing that an individual owns. But when it's my time, I don't care if they're 15, 30 minutes late. I might characterize a little bit, like if I see a pattern, I might be like, well, regardless of the scenario, I'm gonna be a little bit more choiceful of where I use them,
Yeah.
you know, and where I place them. If I'm not gonna put them into a position that's schedule, goal oriented, time focused, you know, I might put them in a more relaxed atmosphere where time's maybe not a necessity.
Well, I mean, I think the thing, going to the judgment spot, so the two, you are all kind of like actually answering abnormally from supposedly the American culture, and I'll kind of explain why where we are, but so there's dichotomous thinking, which is sort of black and white, in or out, and holistic thinking, and you are all talking like holistic thinkers actually, which is, well, there's nuance. Well, I don't like what Ravi Zacharias did, but I do think that this is important, interesting, and I'm not going to completely like throw everything out because of this sin. So the reason why Americans are technically thought of as dichotomous thinking, and an evidence I can point to right now is cancel culture. So if you did this one thing, even like if you think of a historical person, this one historical person had a slave, or a church father was like, women are deformed men, right? Like there are some of our church fathers have said things like that. You just throw them completely out, and that's the traditional American perspective. That's supposedly the perspective of the generations, especially Gen X, Boomer, and Builder, and some somewhat millennial. But this postmodern like kind of Gen Z is becoming more holistic, and they do have way more gray space. They're much more nuanced, but that's also a cultural thing. So other cultures are much more nuanced, but you all have kind of like talked about that a little bit more. Another one is handling crisis. So you have two different groups of people. One is like a crisis orientation. So like we have to think about things. We need to plan for all of the things that could happen wrong, that could go wrong. Versus one that's like, let's just take it as it comes. What do you think is the default majority American perspective? Crisis oriented or non-crisis orientation? Crisis. What do you think? What about Jesus? What do you think Jesus was?
Can we say both?
We can say both for sure. I'm gonna get because we are very crisis oriented. I will give you one good example when he wasn't. It's when he was sleeping during the storm, right? And he was like, "Why did you wake me up?" Right? But Second Timothy 4:2 actually says this: "Preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction." So this verse actually holds both together. So in some ways, be prepared, but also be patient, and recognize that kind of be chill, like go with it, right? Go with the flow, but be prepared. And so, but you have two different cultures, you have two different groups. Our culture is very hyper crisis oriented, and if you have a culture or a group that says like, hey, if something happens, like we'll figure it out, and that person happens to be your youth leader and they're taking a trip, what I think the whole point of this is not to be like, this is where you're going to tell them what to do. The point is to take a step back every time and say, is this a cultural tension? And if it's a cultural tension, what am I willing to like learn that's different than what I feel like I feel comfortable with culturally? And sometimes you still have to go, look, a lot of the parents are coming from this, we got to be more prepared, right? Or we're gonna pair two people up. The person who's gonna have all the plans and preparation, and the other person that knows how to go with the flow when things are just gonna go, if things just need to go with the flow kind of space, or whatever. But these are just all of these things. Like I said, it sounds really cool and ideal to do this like diversity thing. But these are tensions that will happen when we cross cultures and different backgrounds. In Philip Jenkins says that by the year 2050, the United States will still be a Christian nation, but because of immigration, which means that our churches will be full of more global. We will have a more global and a perspective, and we'll have much more probably cultural differences in our churches, even if we did nothing.
Do you think that that's going to be true of like most churches, or do you think it's going to be like the white churches stay white and the growing churches are the ones that are very diverse?
So the thing that we always have these like questions where we don't know what's going to happen, and what I always like to say is what's happening in Europe. So for Pentecostal churches, Assemblies of God Pentecostal churches in Europe, because Pentecostalism is actually really great, does really well in the global South. So we have beautiful heritage, beautiful connections with brothers and sisters. So I think as long as we're not so there's the churches that will insist on staying homogenous, and they will maybe die, to be honest. But the churches that are open, so like what is happening in France is about half the congregation is the Pentecostal brothers and sisters coming from Africa from immigration. And so I think that as long as we're open, maybe not that first generation, because sometimes they need language, but for sure the next, if we do nothing, that second generation is probably just going to walk away from the church. Yeah. Like we need to like be open and connected and ready to bring in people who feel between the two cultures. So we have handling crisis, goals. I think you guys kind of know, so task-oriented versus person-oriented. I'm not going to go into that one too much because I think we talk about that one a lot. Self-worth. So why do you have self-worth? So there's two groups, the status focus, which is this identity. Prestige and worth are determined by the basis of their birth. Their family background is more important than the person's accomplishments. This is a shame-honor situation, so like coming from especially like Asia, Middle East, but also a little bit in Latin America. So respect given on the basis of position This is also important when we preach, the contextualization. So instead of talking about guilt and shame, when we talk about the good news, it's about being adopted in to the family of Christ. It's about community. It's a whole different way that we contextualize and talk and preach. Another, I didn't write it on, the 3D Gospel, it's called. It's a tiny little book. That's also a great contextualization book if you want for preaching and that type of thing. But then there's achievement focus, which is what we are. It's about what your status is. You don't care what my parents did. If I have a PhD, then you want to listen to me, right? So it doesn't matter what my background is, my last name. So another way that this comes out in this status and achievement is that oftentimes the status group, the group of people that believe in status, they also have a high respect for elders, people that are older in the church. And so when you think of that group of people, if they're a percentage of your church, the people who are the oldest person in their family or someone who's been a Christian for a long time, it doesn't mean that all their words are right or perfect, but there just needs to be a lot of honor and respect for people that are elders. And my example is that in France, we have several different church leaders that I work with to do this anti-trafficking ministry, and most of the French ones, they're all in their 60s. All the women that lead these ministries are in their 60s, but the French ones, it's very like egalitarian as we talk. But one of my leaders is Venezuelan, like immigrant from Venezuela to France. And since I'm also Latina, like there's an extra thing where I'm also just very much honoring her in the way that I speak, even though I'm the one with the training, that she is very much like in a very honored space. And I don't know how to explain that. But if we're working with people with different cultures, we just need to consistently, in our words, in the ways that we actually need to go backward and stand up when someone, allow someone to have our seat, be very honoring in the way, in people that, celebrate people who have been in, either in ministry for a long time or who have been a Christian for a really long time and been serving the Lord, and on their birthdays we celebrate their faithfulness to God and those types of things. Vulnerability is kind of the last one, and this is about this idea of the capacity to be vulnerable. So this happens if you've ever been on a mission trip and you had someone get up there and they shared their testimony. It was a woman, let's say, she gets up like into Bangladesh and she's like, yeah, so before I found God, I was just like sleeping around. And then the translator's like, looks at her and goes, before I found God, I did bad things. Because in America, because in our culture, it's like good to be vulnerable. It's like we are connected because we're vulnerable. In other cultures, the amount of shame that would come upon someone if they were that vulnerable is certain cultures, like that's the honor. It's going back to honor shame. So certain cultures, that's why you have honor killings, right? Like you've put shame on our family, and then in other cultures you have, like in Asian cultures, certain Asian cultures, suicide. I put so much shame on my family that I should not go commit suicide. So you want to avoid the shame, and so another way to talk about that is direct versus indirect, or high context versus low context conversations. So am I going to directly, if someone is working for me or working with me, I have a leader who is Chinese, or a leader who is from Bangladesh or India or something or whatever, I am not going to say, hey, your sermon was good, but let me tell you all the ways that you need to make that better, right? I might say something like, have you read this book on preaching? I really loved this chapter. And what I've said to them is, here's where you need to work on your sermon, without directly telling them they did something wrong. And that is a cultural thing, and I always get, when I teach this in class, I always get people being like, but that's not honest. And I'm like, do you tell someone that you don't like their haircut when you don't like their haircut? No. Like you just say like, oh, that's interesting. That was an interesting choice, or whatever you want to do. But we are always direct. Yeah.
It's like if you walk up to somebody and they have really bad breath, you don't say, oh, your breath is horrendous.
Yeah.
I'm a breath pit.
Yeah, you're like, hey, would you like some gum? Exactly.
Yeah.
And obviously
exactly.
we're talking about diversity on a large scale, but I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot in Oyama is this idea of being people smart and learning how to speak to different people. And so even not looking at other cultures, racially or whatever other cultures, you could see even within this room, how I'm going to speak to Terry is going to be different than how I speak to Adam, because
Right.
How is she going to hear me? How are we going to have a relationship and converse with each other? Maybe different than how we will. I have Oyama students that have told me, they've said, I learn best when you tell me just I'm being stupid.
Yeah.
And then I have other Oyama students that if I said you're being stupid, it would crush them. And so I have to be very, I can say the same thing, yes, without saying the word stupid or saying you are.
Yeah, there's like shared culture, and then there's also like personal culture, and like with your own family. And you all figure out your own family culture when you get married, right? Because then all of a sudden you're like, what? The medicine's supposed to be in the bath, or no, it's in the kitchen, or whatever. And so all of those things happen.
So nice before we got married.
But
Oh, never mind, sorry.
I have two little takeaway things, and then I want to just open it up to you. I want to think about what you think or what your ideas are, or maybe your own. We can talk together, because I think we can all come up. We're not experts, so we can come up with solutions together if you have some specific questions in your mind. But one of the big things is like we need to think about everything we do. There's like words that are spoken, and then there's actual symbols that are happening. Like today, right now, what is symbolized by the way that we're sitting at this moment?
Well, you guys are the experts because you're seated up front. We're listening to you.
Yep.
You're controlling what is done in the room.
Yeah, so that's definitely a symbol. Anything else? I mean, we didn't set it up, because I wouldn't have set it up. Maybe like I would have put us at the same level as you in my own heart.
As you were talking about seating, I was trying to change my seating, so could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I was just asking, like, what does this setup say to you?
Learning.
Yeah.
Learning atmosphere.
Learning atmosphere. You have tables. You're not in rows, so I think it was maybe meant to make it feel a little more like a discussion, sort of. Everything we do has a symbol. So when we say, for example, in the Assemblies of God, and I know it's being recorded, when we say in the Assemblies of God, it's okay. We are for women in ministry, but if you look at a lot of our like leadership spaces, you don't see a lot of women. Like we're saying one thing, but we're symbolizing something out. We're putting something else as a symbol, right? And then putting Donna Brett in that actually did symbolize something, right? So we're trying to, so the same thing is happening in your church. So if you already have a little bit of diversity, like the idea of like having someone, if you don't have anyone that's ready to preach it, but maybe having someone do announcements, or someone to do prayer, or making sure that the people that pass out communion, or making sure that you have those symbols happening, so that when someone comes in, they go, look, this is a church for everybody. Or like I said about missionaries, like making sure that you have mission. If you know there's a missionary that's from a different ethnicity, bringing them in, or specifically asking, can your wife preach? And that's just the women thing, but like, can your wife preach? Because we just want to have we just want also our young women to know that women can be missionaries, or whatever it is. But like, those are all symbols. So putting diversity in your space, like making it kind of clear. Another thing is, if you don't have that yet, when you do your stories, when you think about when you do your sermon, having people of different backgrounds read that sermon before you preach it. Is this answering the questions you have about the text? Again, if I'm talking about guilt and innocence, and I put this whole thing about guilt and shame, guilt as in a judicial way. That's a very Western perspective. That may or may not minister to the Congolese immigrant who is looking at, what do I do about this voodoo thing that someone put on me? Because that's power. And the gospel speaks to all those things. That's what's cool. So making sure, and this is even smart too, if you have, like, for example, if you have only men preaching or whatever, making sure that your stories make sense to everybody else who's listening. Making sure that you're contextualizing, and again, decontextualizing in a way, and then contextualizing. So these are just some thoughts about how to bring diversity, symbolize it, bring it into your preaching. But these are some
questions or things.
Questions. So so these are, I'm gonna throw them all out there, and then you guys just answer the ones you want to answer, because we have like 7 minutes. What are some barriers to multi-ethnic churches? How would this affect Sunday service, for example? What is an action step to walk away with? Or what is the progressive step God is asking of us in relation to ethnic diversity? If there's any questions, because I think usually what happens first is you listen to something and you're like, I can find all, or this is what I do, I can find all the reasons why that's not going to work. And that's okay, we can talk about those things, because I think it's not easy at all. Yeah.
I just had a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for
Tokenism
it.
is such a big word, and I was just talking with Debbie about this, where I think it can get thrown into conversations about creating a culture of diversity, but not knowing if someone's doing it to check a box or to actually represent the kingdom of God. And in some cases, we won't actually know the answer. You know, like a business or something that's like has a new diversity clause in their, thing. So what is the difference between this and tokenism? And if we come up against that argument, like, oh, you're just doing this to, check a box, how do we kind of talk through that?
I think I can really speak to this, because right now I'm the only female and the only non-white person in the College of Ministry at Northwest University in the College of Ministry. And so if I am there to check a box, then that means when I speak, people don't hear me. But if I'm there because they want to hear my voice when I speak, and Dr. Ziefel, I'm not just saying this because I'm being recorded, does listen, because he's like, well, this is the female voice I have, and it's the only one I have right now. So the difference between tokenism and actually looking for diversity is you're actually willing to listen and learn to the voice that you put in that space. Like, it's not just a seat at the table, it's a voice at the table.
That's good, thank you.
So could I ask you just to piggyback a little bit? Just yesterday, I know we don't have a lot of time, but just yesterday, we, for the Assemblies of God in Oregon, voted on a resolution to have an official position for a female on the presbytery. It's great, it's wonderful. But I asked my wife, I said, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to do that, right? It would just naturally happen that there are men and women. Is it how do I put this? Disrespectful in a sense where it's like, oh, I may be qualified, and yes, they may want my ideas and my voice at the table, and they'll give me that, but if this position wasn't here, I wouldn't be at the table.
So,
like, what's the best way to go about it? Is it good to have something like that?
There's studies that show that, like, you will like people that are like you. So, like, I've been in hiring committees, right? And you end up, like, I'll be looking at the exact same person, and everybody around me who's not like me, like, who's, like, especially, like, in hiring committee where it's all male, they'll be like, that guy was really good. And I'm like, what? Like, no, it was this person that was, like, the better candidate. So, like, you have to start somewhere. And also, like, for example, in higher education, me being a professor, the act of me being, someone seeing themselves in me makes my students go, I want to be a professor. Brucey's a professor. As a female, I could be a professor too. So there's something about, like, just having someone there so if we don't get past an appointed position, then that's problematic. But if we can get past it, so, like, we've had it happen actually in the national level at the Assemblies of God, where we've actually, there's this female presbyter now that isn't a female presbyter position, it's just a position that a female happened to win. The same, if we can get past it, then it's a good thing. If we now for 20 years only ever have a woman on there because there's a seat for a woman, then that's
then that kind of tells us that it's tokenism.
Yes.
Or at least would be a sign that it could be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the idea is that it would just make it a normal thing, but we have to make it normal first.
Yeah.
We have to make it kind of like, acceptable. Well, yeah, or just for people to feel comfortable and understand what it is.
Potentially inspire other women to have that position.
Do you know how many churches there are that were planted by women, and then once that woman, like, left that position, never had a woman as a senior pastor in the history of that church again.
Right.
Too many.
There was one no vote yesterday.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
If I could add too, I think tokenism, will very rarely sacrifice, which is what usually needs to happen in those. I mean, like, you're giving up a seat
Yeah.
for another to have one. So I think, you know, there's a lot of that going on. I think even for, so I work at a big church. We have like a staff of like 40 people. We have not had any people of color in positions of leadership for most of our history, and I and another individual have been one of the first, and a lot of people who were, you could say qualified or whatever, maybe even older and have more experience, could have very easily been given that job, but we were not only because it was like, hey, we want more diversity in our staff, but it's this aspect of reaching the people, like you said. But there had to be some sacrifice in that, and I think that's the real big thing, that if it's just tokenism, because I think there'll be where the rubber meets the road at some level, and when that happens, I think it will play out, whether that's not their tokenism or not. So.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Or yeah.
I just had a question out of curiosity. Trying to think of how to phrase this. So obviously, like, you as a woman in ministry, you're a professor, and you see yourself currently at Kirkland as like the only one of your kind there. Like, how many other women or, you know, other people do you see working to get there? Just wondering, like,
They're just trying to be wanting to be a professor.
like trying to be a professor, or trying to, you know, to get to that status. Like, how many do you see?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know that there was a lot. So if you're talking about, or kind of all like in this, like Son was a God, right? So I was surprised to know that people so I'm 40. I was surprised to know that people my age, women my age, weren't encouraged in a lot of districts to even get credentials, or older than me, my age or older. Like, so then they didn't get them till they were in their 60s and they've been doing ministry all their life. You probably all know people like that. And so even though that they were really doing ministry this whole time, you know, and they were encouraged to do that. So you're really only seeing, just to get credentialed, you're really only seeing probably people a little bit younger than me, like mid-30 and under, that were really actually really encouraged to go ahead and get credentials, even though we've always credentialed women. And then, especially if you marry a minister, it's like, oh, it's okay, you can just go on your husband's credentials. But now we're kind of encouraging both. And so I think it's a lag, because higher education, to go all the way up to a PhD level, and then especially if you think children are going to be a part of that and all this other stuff so I think that I see a lot of people in their 20s, not as many people in their 30s, my generation, women. Usually my generation waits till all their kids are teenagers, and then they do it in their 50s or 60s. They go up to that level. But I do see way more young women in their 20s, like, considering it now. Yeah, that's just what I see. I don't know if you guys have seen other things. But if you know young women who want to get into the academic world, like, let's do everything we can to get them there, because we have a shortage for sure of women, especially in Bible, in theology, and Old and New Testament.
I was going to say, one of the barriers that I see is that it almost would say a generational barrier. I worked at a church in California, and we had 5 different ethnicities that were part of our church, but each one had its own separate service, and there was almost no crossover except for us in the youth ministry, where it was all their kids came to our stuff, and I'm sitting here going, are we really being that multi-ethnic church, or are we just a building that's holding that, you know, like, and so I think the students were all ready and willing to do that, and we were trying to put in to where once a month I wanted to send the kids to service with their parents, so they were in their own culture and stuff like that, and all the pushback came from the older people that were like, no, we can't do that, we need to, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. But I had parents coming to me crying because they're like, I'm feeling like I'm teaching, because they didn't speak the language, so they're like, I'm feeling like I'm teaching my kids the Bible as I'm translating for the pastor, and I was just sitting there, it blew me away that it was, I think that's one of those barriers, that getting that mindset change at that older generational level to say, hey, this is something that's not okay to keep separate. I mean, how long has it been that youth ministry and children's ministry have had to be separate, from the rest of the church as well? And I think that's where I see one big barrier to having that integrated diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, and it speaks to, we had a similar type of scenario question last session. It's not like it's just the white church that is wanting to be separated. It is also largely because it's comfortable, it's easy, and so I think both parties, you're right, both parties need that message that integration is actually more beautiful, but it is harder, and that's the trick. And that's, I think, what I said earlier is integration is harder, but it's actually also the most formative for us as believers. So not only getting exposed to different people groups, expressions of worship, all this other stuff, but there's insights that they have that you don't, and vice versa. And it's just all that. It's not only formative, but it's also a clearer picture of what heaven is like, which is is more attractive to the outside world, right? So I think one, yes, it is extremely hard to, both parties need the message, but it's imperative that we do it. So
I think that kind of goes into your second question there too, about even just looking at a service, right? Looking at a regular like Sunday service. Obviously that's ideal, but that's so much harder, because if I'm a lead pastor, and you guys are the lead pastor, you can speak to this, but like I'd be afraid, and I've spoken to lead pastors who are afraid to make changes of any kind, let alone one that's going to be that difficult and require some compromise in a sense, right, culturally, because you are going to lose people. And it's not necessarily that it's like, oh, well, I'm going to lose people who are mad, but like you as a pastor, you don't want one to slip through the cracks, right? And as a pastor, if I'm a pastor of an all-white church, I care about my white people just as much as I do any other culture. And so I could see being like, but if we make these changes to bring in other cultures, which is good, and you're right, is a more complete picture of heaven and Bible, am I gonna then not be able to minister to the people I have?
I think it's how you implement that cultural shift.
Yeah. And also, just think about this, like everything you just said, like that's what we talk, every time we do short-term mission, that's what we say. We're like, it's good for us to go, like those same white people are fine to go to another country and spend thousands of dollars to go learn about another culture. So why wouldn't they be okay with learning about another culture in their own
They should.
in their own synagogue, in their own tabernacle. What am I saying? Why am I saying different words?
We're getting Jewish over here.
Synagogue, tabernacle, in their own sanctuary. Sanctuary.
I agree. I mean, I think it comes back to leadership. It comes back to like, are you discipling your people biblically and doing it?
I would say too, I mean, I think that is right. How you do it really matters, no question about it. But also, you kind of got to put your money where your mouth is. Are you really wanting to lean to the spirit of what he's probably calling us to do, rather than what's logistically more comfortable? That's like a honest question you have to ask yourself as a pastor, even if you are losing people.
I just feel like people get surprised at how much they learn from other culture, like how enriching another culture can really be. And like it's actually benefit, like there's so much,
Taste and see.
And it's not like, and again, it's not like, I like that you said this, it's not like, oh, it's like only like white American culture that is going to learn, but like also like a congregation or a group of people that is like really brought themselves and like closed themselves into only their diaspora group probably does need to interact with white America and understand that, like, and have like this is how we, learn and grow from each other. It's mutual, for sure. Yeah. We have resources over here, some books that in this my beautiful handwriting. Sorry if it's not wonderful. It's really quick, but if you need like a typed out version, we can send that to you too. But
we can send an email.
Yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
sure.
Yeah. So we have some different some of the books that I referenced right away, the top two, and then some other theological books.
Would you guys be willing to share your PowerPoint, your slides with
Yeah.
awesome, with Debbie or whatever you send to me?
Sure.
You know which one. Very cool.
For sure.
I just have so many questions.
And Debbie can disperse them out.
Yeah.
Well, what I think is kind of cool about this is that, I mean, we're talking, ethnicity, but I think it can also transfer over to people groups.
Yep.
In Myrtle Point, large population we have, but there was two dominant mentalities. There was, this is my town and the druggies took it over. And there's the druggies that we determined we would rather just call God's desired rather than riffraff. And so I actually have people say, I don't go to your church because of the kind of people you have at your church.
Yeah.
And I look at them, I'm like, I'm not gonna apologize. That's your choice, but I'm not gonna apologize. And that church ended up doing really well, but it never, in my opinion, reached its full potential that God had for it. Because people couldn't get past that stigmatism of we're better than them.
That's 100%. I mean, this is what we deal with too, because basically a pastor or someone from the church says, we want to do this ministry to women in prostitution. But man, you don't know how many people in that church are not excited about having women. Like my husband's gonna look. They have all these ideas, and you're like, look at what Jesus did, man. Like we don't even have to. We don't have to go deep to figure out what Jesus thinks about women in prostitution and what is. And so, anyways, but yeah. So you still have like groups of people that are like, well, I'm not gonna go there if this group of people is gonna be part of this church. And
yeah, the police officers were like, I'm not going there because I've arrested a lot of them. Like, you haven't arrested me.
I think the church in general is really comfortable with saying, like, we want to minister to everyone. But when we really break down what does that mean, what does it look like to minister with everyone?
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm comfortable with that, right? Like in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, I want to minister to everyone. But then I look at my life and I go, do I?
It's messy and uncomfortable.
No.
It's really messy and uncomfortable. But yeah, you're right. It's one thing to say, I'll never deny Christ.
Yeah.
But we were never Peter.
Right. Yeah, we're doing I'm not a part of the Assemblies of God, by the way. I'm a CMA
Oh, that's
guy. So
Thrown everything out.
we have a conference going on right now, and one of the plenary speakers said kind of this idea around the table, and basically said, judging by the people who are at your table will reflect whether you are a Pharisee or a disciple of Jesus.
That's good.
So I think that's a good way to leave off, maybe. Or
Yeah. Thank you so much for interacting.
Is there a microphone?
Just pick this thing up and just throw it on the ground. It's fine.
That was like the perfect conclusion.
Alright, so you guys are officially on break for 20 minutes and then we'll be meeting.
Thanks so much,
What a
man.
good room moderator. Good job.
Thanks, y'all.
You got this too, yeah?
Well, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to email it to you from this computer?
No,
sit down and talk about- Especially because, yeah, I mean, you know the area.
Just say it's an audio file.
One of the things that I know that I've been talking about with a lot of the Salem area pastors is how do we minister to the Hispanic community that the white people don't seem to want to have anything to do with, but equally don't want anything to do with